Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about how the major scale connects to the CAGED system and how you can build the major scale around any given note. And if you haven't already, I do suggest you watch my other video where I talk about the CAGED system in detail, just so you have a better foundation before watching this one. So I'll link that in the description for you. And so this video is also kind of a part 2 to the video I made about how the pentatonic scales connect to the CAGED system. And the reason why I'm breaking this down this way is because I really want to start to paint the picture about how everything connects on the fretboard. So all chords and scales and everything you find on the fretboard connects together in a very specific way through the CAGED system. And I really want to start to paint that picture for you and kind of connect those dots. So let's get a little closer and talk about how the major scale fits into all that. All right, so the first shape we're going to cover is, of course, our C shape, right? So let's first establish what chord we're playing here, right? Since our pinky is on this note here, we know that we're playing the F major chord, right? Because our pinky here is on the F note. And so the major scale that is associated to this shape looks like this. All right, so how exactly does this major scale shape correspond to this chord shape? Well, we know that a chord is made up of the first, third, and fifth degree of any given scale, right? And the major scale is made up of all 7, so 1 to 7. And so when we add the second, fourth, fifth, and sixth scale degree to this chord shape, right, to make it into the major scale, that is the shape that we get. And so just as this note right here is your chord identifier in this shape, this is also going to be your key identifier in the major scale shape. And now it's very important to remember where the key identifiers are in each shape, because that is where we're going to build our scale around. That note is where we're going to build the scale around. So for example, let's say we want to play a solo in the key of A major, right? We would find an A note, right? And we could find one here on the second string, right? So great, we found our A note, but what now? What do we do with this? Well, we know that in the C shape, the key identifier is on this second string here. So we can just fill in the shape, right? The C shape around this note, and we could play that scale. So that's why it's very important to not only memorize the shapes, right? The major scale shapes, but also where the key identifiers are in the shapes. All right, so now let's move on to our A shape. So we will just play a random chord here, and let's establish what chord we're playing. So in the A shape, the chord identifier is on the second string here where your index is. So right here, we are playing the E note. So this is the E chord. So now let's talk about the major scale that is associated to this shape. And that looks like this. And so the same concept is going to apply, right? This note here is your chord identifier in the A shape. So this note here is going to be your key identifier in the major scale shape. So now let's say you wanted to play a solo using the major scale in the key of G major, right? Well, you would find the G note along the second string here, right? So you can find it right here. And then you would just fill in that A shape around the G note, right? And just play the major scale. All right, now onto our G shape. So we could play a G shape right here, right? And we are playing the C sharp chord, C sharp major chord, because our chord identifier is right here, and this is the C sharp note. And the major scale associated to this shape looks like this. And just as this note here is the chord identifier in the G chord shape, this is also your key identifier in the major scale shape. So again, if we wanted to play along to something in the key of F sharp major, we would find an F sharp along the first string here. So we would find one right here, and see how we could fill in this G-shaped chord around this F sharp note, right? And we can then play this shape's associated major scale. Now onto our E shape. So we could pick a random E-shaped chord right here, and we are playing the B major chord, right? Because our index is on the B note right here. And the major scale associated to this shape looks like this. And just as this note is the chord identifier in the E shape, it's also going to be your key identifier in your major scale shape. And lastly, our D shape. So pick a random D-shaped chord right here. And in this case, we're playing the A major chord, right? Because this note here is A. And this is the major scale associated to this shape here. And now the D-shaped one is a little bit of a tricky one to visualize just because it jumps around a lot from the root note here, or from the key identifier here. But the way that I like to see it is by thinking that an octave of this key identifier here is 4 frets down, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4 on the third string here. So this is also a key identifier, right? This is an A note here, and this is also an A note here. And I find it helpful to visualize this as a second anchor, right? As a second key identifier, where I can then use this note to build the major scale around. So it's another way to memorize it. So let's say you wanted to solo in the major scale in the key of F major, right? We could find an F note on this string here, right? And then we could play the major scale around that, right? But we could just have easily found an F note on the third string here, right? So if we find one here, we could use this note to build the D-shaped major scale around, right? And so now how do all these shapes connect? Well, they connect in the exact same way that the pentatonic shapes connect. Because if you notice, the only difference between the pentatonic scale and the major scale is that the major scale has 2 extra notes, right? The pentatonic scale is built off of the first, second, third, fifth, and sixth degrees of any given scale. And the major scale is built of 1 to 7s. So you could navigate through the major scales in the exact same way as you would navigate through the pentatonic scales, just with 2 extra notes per shape. So the order of connection is exactly the same. And the entirety of those shapes connected is movable down the fretboard depending on what key you're playing in. So let's say you want to solo using the major scale in the key of B major. Well, we could find any B note on the fretboard and then plug in the major scale shape where that B note on that specific string serves as the key identifier. So let's say we use this B note right here, right? Well, we know that in the G shape, right, the key identifier is on the first string. So we can now plug in the G-shaped major scale around this note, right? And of course, you'll have different options of shapes to choose from, because also in the E shape, the key identifier is also on the top string here. So that's going to be just up to your own discretion to choose whichever shape you like. But let's just stick to this shape here, right? The B major chord in the G shape. And since we're in the G shape here, we can now move through the shapes in order, right? So now if we wanted to move up the fretboard here, we would be moving into the E shape, right? Because that's the next in the order. And so now let's say you wanted to move down the fretboard from the G shape. Well, then you would be moving into the A shape, right? And so that is going to apply for any key that you're in. And so now how do you practice all this? Well, start simple and go through shape by shape. So start with your C shape, right? And what I want you to drill is not only the actual shape of the major scale, but also where the root note or the key identifier is in the shape. That is very, very important, right? And then you would do that with all the shapes, right? C through D. And then once you have that down, you could start to connect the shapes and start to move through different shapes. You could connect 2 shapes together and move through those. And then you can add a third shape and then move through those. And again, make sure you are also memorizing where the key identifiers are in the shapes. That's very important. All right, guys, so that is it. I hope that was helpful. And I hope you start to see, or I hope you're starting to see how everything is kind of connecting, right? Everything is kind of just one big puzzle that connects through kind of patterns in a certain sequence. So I'll leave you with that, and let me know what you guys think. And don't forget to let me know some other videos you would like me to make. I have a list of videos I need to make, and I'm always adding to it. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.